If you're a fan of classic game re-releases, then listen up, because Limited Run Games just announced a whole slate full of upcoming releases, and a lot of them are actually worth getting excited about. The titles include the cinematic adventure game Fear Effect, fan favorite platformer Tomba 2, and the beat-em-up classic Fighting Force. They also announced a Bubsy the Bobcat collection, but we're gonna get to that tomorrow. For today, we're gonna find out if any of these limited run re-releases are actually worth playing. And to do that, I decided to flip through the pages of Electronic Gaming Monthly, Edge, Next Generation, and more classic magazines to see what the critics said back when these games first came out. Oh, I sure hope you don't scare easily, because this is another horrifying episode of Limited Run Review Crew.
One sphere takes over, the lines of reality blur, making it impossible to tell whether you're playing or being played.
PlayStation.
4 years after first introducing the world to Lara Croft, Eidos was still riding high off of the breakout success of Tomb Raider. The Last Revelation was coming out later that year, the Angelina Jolie movie was currently in production, and Lara was still winding up on a bunch of magazine covers. But what if suddenly everybody got bored of video games' leading lady? Don't worry, Eidos had another impossibly attractive action star waiting in the wings. Fear Effect is a weird mashup of everything that was big in the 1980s and 90s. Literally taking elements from Blade Runner, Indiana Jones, The Sixth Sense, classic John Woo films, and even survival horror. Despite its many influences, Fear Effect is an ambitious game that not only told an elaborate story over the course of 4 discs, but also toyed with the visuals. The graphics are a combination of cel-shaded characters interacting with a pre-rendered world made up of full-motion video loops. That's a fun thing to think about in retrospect, but what did the critics say back in 2000? Let's go ahead and start with Electronic Gaming Monthly, who thought Fear Effect was another winner from Eidos. Giving it an average score of 9 out of 10, they appreciated that it was a more mature game. John gave it a 9 and said that you really wouldn't know that this was an American game. In terms of production value and storyline, it has a lot in common with the very best that anime has to offer. Despite some niggly control issues, oversimplified puzzles, and the fact that it's a bit too short for 4 discs worth of game, it has to be said that Fear Effect is top-notch. The plot is simply superb, and it's filled with twists and surprises. A true adult game. Dean largely agreed, though gave it a slightly lower 8.5 out of 10. Intriguing is the best way to describe Fear Effect. Sounds like hype, but the characters, plot, the Blade Runner-like ambiance, it all melds together to create quite a surrealistic thriller. The fortunate part is that no one element weakens the game. If it had bad control or impossible puzzles, it would ruin the vibe. If anything, it's a little obvious at times, but nothing major. I highly recommend this one. As it turns out, EGM's average was actually Fear Effect's highest score, while PSM gave the game a very similar 4.5 out of 5. The rest of the critics went lower. This includes Insight Video Gaming, which gave the blockbuster release a score of 4 out of 5. That's the same score we saw from Next Generation, who argued that you're bound to get frustrated at points. For every 20 seconds of gameplay you have before you die, you have to endure 10 to 15 seconds of loading. It's maddening. There's also a lack of intuitiveness in some of the puzzles. At times you'll feel like banging your head into the wall. Still, if you love a good story and have the patience to live with the game's few flaws, Fear Effect should go a long way to tiding you over until you get your hands on a PlayStation 2. Now, when it comes to the lowest score, we have to turn to Next Generation's sister magazine, Edge. They gave it a low 6 out of 10, arguing that although Fear Effect looks great, there are serious gameplay faults that undermine the experience. Fundamentally, the balance between puzzle solving and beating the end-of-the-level bosses is extremely flawed, and the game's clumsy control system makes the boss encounters absurdly difficult. You actually come to dread the arrival of the next big bad guy, which hampers the effectiveness of the storyline. In such a beautifully cinematic game featuring clever plotting and scripting, such deficiencies are even more offensive. It'll be interesting to see what kind of quality of life updates that come with the re-release, if any. This is one of those games that really wowed me at the time, but I don't know, some of those imperfections mentioned here may be a lot more glaring a quarter century later. Last year, when we looked at the reviews for the original Tomba, pretty much everybody hoped that Limited Run would also give us a port of the sequel, Tomba 2: The Evil Swine Returns. Well, good news everybody! Limited Run listened, and the 2000 sequel will be heading to modern consoles sometime in 2025, just in time to celebrate the game's 25th anniversary. Once again, this is a side-scrolling platformer that has a nice mix of adventure and role-playing elements tossed in to make it stand out a little bit. This is an even bigger and more ambitious game that takes the platforming cliches and flips them on their head. While it's not what I would call a massive hit, the game was a critical darling and a fan favorite that has become something of a cult classic. Now, we'll get to the high scores in a minute, but first, I want to check in with Electronic Gaming Monthly. Giving Tomba 2 a score of 7.9 out of 10, EGM was actually on the lower end of the scale. Che kicked things off with what, I can only call an extremely controversial take. Luckily, very little of Tomba 2 involves Tomba stumbling around in 3D. Nothing wrong with 3D games, but I'll take my platformers in a pseudo 3D if possible. Thanks. Even though developers Whoopee Camp have added lots more to the sub-quest this time around, some of them still suffer from the same sort of tedium from the first game. However, the game is full of charm and has more than enough challenges to keep both young and mature gamers busy. Shu agreed. This game is bright, colorful, solid, entertaining, unique, and addicting. The multi-branching paths may drive some of you a little nuts, especially if you're looking for a more traditional 2.5D game, if there even is such a thing. Still, there's so much to see and do in Tomba 2 that it's well worth the bucks. For the most part, the scores for Tomba 2 were in the 80% range. When PSM reviewed the game in their 30th issue, they gave it a 4 out of 5. That's the exact same score that you saw over at Insight Video Gaming. And even Next Generation gave it a 4 out of 5, raving that it's everything its predecessor was and a whole lot more. Overall, the game remains every bit as engrossing and even more playable than its forerunner. Though you can't help but imagine what it could have been if the creators had taken the plunge and afforded Tomba full 3D movement. Chalk that idea up to the inevitable sequel. Now, when it comes to the highest score, we need to talk about GameFan. Well, they gave it an average score of 86%. That doesn't exactly tell the full story. Depending on who you believe, Tomba 2 is either one of the best games of the year, or it's just kinda so-so. Let's start with Fury, who gave it a near-perfect 96%. Light years ahead of its predecessor in every possible way. Tomba 2 is more fun than a bar mitzvah. I can't say that I was a fan of the original, but I'm sold now. The mini puzzles are just the right difficulty, and they're varied enough to keep you into it as you slap some pig booty. Tomba 2 passes the Fury checklist with flying colors. Graphics, gameplay, sound, fun factor. Now where's my N64 Tomba? And then there's Ego, who ended up giving it a 78%. Swine's Revenge is not my cup of tea. Granted, it's designed for kids. But will little Timmy like this? I hope not. Sure, there's a lot of little chores to do and multitasking galore, but I don't want to do chores in my games, I want fun, which is what Tomba 2 is not. There may be mini-games up the wazoo, but if none of them are fun, then what do we have? Another year, another Tomba I will pass on. At least it's more fun than Spyro 2. Yeah, that's the random nonsense that you saw over at GameFan. Just imagine trying to make a buying decision based off of reading those two reviews. Oof. Personally, I'm more in Fury's camp. This is one of those cult classics that has actually aged well and still is a lot of fun to go back to. I'm definitely looking forward to this re-release.
Just because you've got the hair doesn't mean you've got the power. Rated E for everyone. Tomba 2, The Evil Swine return.
PlayStation.
For a brief moment at the end of the 20th century, beat-em-ups were the next big thing. From Double Dragon to Final Fight to Streets of Rage, it looked like the 1990s was going to be dominated by brawlers. And then Street Fighter II smacked us upside the head and largely sidelined the traditional arcade beat-em-up. In 1997, the developers behind Tomb Raider attempted to inject new life into the ailing genre by creating what amounts to be a Streets of Rage 3D. Yeah, that's not an accident, as Fighting Force was originally developed with the hopes that Sega would pick it up as Streets of Rage 4. They didn't, but were given a knockoff game that takes all the brawler cliches and brings them kicking and screaming into the 3D world. Now, while Core and Eidos may have wanted to take gamers back to the good old days of beat-em-ups, not every critic was along for that ride. In fact, I would say that the reviews skew negative, largely due to brawler fatigue. Electronic Gaming Monthly gave the game an average score of 7.6 out of 10. Fake Ninja Sushi X seemed confused. Much hype has been surrounding Fighting Force for months now, but I'm not sure why. Sure, it's a decent game, complete with 3D Final Fight action. So what if there are secrets in each area, like the bars you can rip off the doors to use as weapons? When it comes down to it, the gameplay becomes repetitive in about 1 minute. I was disappointed with the overall number of attacks for each character. Kelly liked the game a little bit more, giving it a 7.5 out of 10 and concluding that it's fun to run around, smashing the skulls of men in black and throwing them into oncoming traffic. The peripheral objects in Fighting Force are much more interactive than they are in other games in the genre. Although Fighting Force has cool moves and combos, the control is a little floaty and the 3D camera occasionally blocks the view. GameFan largely agreed with EGM's score, giving Fighting Force an average of 71%, which is just a little bit better than the 3.5 out of 5 that it received from PSM. Edge ended up giving the game a lower score of 6 out of 10, concluding that for about 5 stages, this is all great fun. But Fighting Force's major drawback soon becomes apparent. There's no lack of action, yet there's little change in gameplay. Players simply fight group after group of enemies until you move on to the next stage and repeat the exercise against new backdrops. Plug in a second joypad and the experience is more enjoyable, but it ultimately suffers from the predictable monotony. In its efforts to reinvent the scrolling beat-em-up, Core has overlooked the need to update the genre's gameplay. Of course, Edge wasn't the only magazine to be down on Fighting Force, as Computer and Video Games also gave the game a 3 out of 5. That's the exact same score that you saw from Next Generation, who explained that despite its derivative nature, Fighting Force is a very fun game. Yet it's not the same huge leap forward for the Final Fight genre that you might expect from the creators of Tomb Raider. Now, if you want to end this episode on a more positive note and see the highest score, then look no further than GamePro. Giving it a 4 out of 5, Johnny Ballgame said that despite its few flaws, Fighting Force delivers the fierce fun and beat-full silly action that PlayStation gamers are looking for. Take it for a rumble if you have the guts to bash the bad guy and save the world. Well, I probably like this game more than Edge or Next Generation. There's no question that it's both derivative and definitely repetitive. Of course, that can be said about a lot of the games in the genre. As somebody who has successfully beaten brawler fatigue, I'm excited to see this game find new life on modern consoles.
No rules. No ring. No exit. And no place to hide. Take a fight outside. Fighting Force, Lighthouse Interactive.
Hey, thanks for watching me break down these classic reviews. What I said at the beginning is true. This is just the first part of a 2-day event. We're going to be covering everything that Limited Run announced. We're going to be back tomorrow with a look at 5 classic Bubsy the Bobcat games. It's huge. You'll definitely want to tune in for that. Now, here's the question I have for you. What's your favorite 3D beat-em-up? Not fighting game, but brawler like Fighting Force. And yes, I'll let you get away with God of War, but only the old ones. In other news, we're going to be back tomorrow with another Review Crew episode, this one devoted to Bubsy the Bobcat. If that sounds good to you, then I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then,